This happened over 20 years ago. I grew up with just my mom. I was an only child, and my dad was not in the picture at the time. Our house was a small townhouse in a large complex. Even though it was a good area, our complex was known as one of the poorer parts. At 13 years old, I didn't mind, because two of my good friends lived there as well. We always had a good time together. There was a pool in our complex, and it was open in the summer. Even some of the richer kids would come by and hang out sometimes. We had one creepy neighbor though. His name was Jude, and he lived in the townhouse adjacent to ours. He was a strange guy, always wearing the same faded jacket with unkempt hair over his eyes. He rarely spoke to anyone, and when he did, it was often something weird. Kids and our neighbors whispered stories about him, but I never paid much attention. When I got home from school on Thursday, my mom was working late. I made my own dinner, did my homework, and was watching TV when I heard a knock on the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw Jude standing there, shifting uneasily on his feet. Something about the way he looked at the door made my stomach twist. This was the first time I had seen him do something like that. We had been neighbors for almost 6 months, and we'd hardly ever talked.
"Hey kid,"
he said, his voice muffled from the door.
"Your mom asked me to check on you."
I didn't believe him. My mom never mentioned anything about Jude checking in on me. "Thanks, I'm fine," I replied, hoping he would go away. He didn't leave though. Instead, he tried the doorknob, which thankfully was locked, and he started banging on the door, almost as if he was trying to break it down. I stood on the other side, praying it would stop. I then shouted through the door that I was calling my mom. At that, he finally stopped and left. Once he was gone, I walked to the back door to make sure it was locked too. It was, so I went back to the living room. My mom got home about an hour later, and against my better judgment, I didn't tell her about it. I thought maybe I was overreacting, but after that day, I noticed Jude more. He was always there. It was like he was always watching. Maybe he was spying on me, or maybe I just became more aware. A few weeks later, I was out with two of my friends, Tom and Colin. We were walking down the street, and I realized Jude was following us. We sped up, turning corners in an attempt to lose him, but he kept up. Finally, we broke into a run. Once we started, I looked back, and Jude was running too, but he gave up quickly, not able to keep up with us. Later that evening, we were hanging around outside a KFC. We didn't buy anything, but we were sitting on the outdoor tables. Jude suddenly appeared. Then he came over and walked straight up to our table. He started trying to talk to us, but we were clearly uncomfortable. He then asked us some strange questions. Specifically, I remember him asking if my mom was home. I said she was, even though I thought she was at work again that night. That instantly brought back memories of the night he came to our house. My friends already knew about it, because I told them after it happened. Jude lingered for another 10 or 15 minutes. We were all uncomfortable, and finally he walked away. We left soon after, and as we were approaching my house, we saw him following us again. Tom and Colin were going to come to my place and hang out a while longer. When we got to my door, Jude was walking side by side with us as if we were friends, even though he was at least 40. When I went up to the door, he tried to follow us inside, but I stopped him before he could. Before opening the door, I turned to Jude and told him I'd call the cops if he didn't leave. He hesitated, then backed off and walked away. The three of us were creeped out, so both of my friends agreed to stay, at least until my mom got home. While we were waiting, we put on a movie and barely watched it. I peered out the front window every once in a while, and I could see Jude standing there in the parking lot in front of our house. He was there for almost an hour, and then he must have gone home. That night, I told my mom everything, including the first incident. She was furious. The next day, she spoke to the landlord. Within a week, Jude was gone. The rumor is that he'd been evicted. We think that my mom's complaint was not the first one that had been leveled against him. Either that, or he had some kind of record. We never found out for sure. For a long time after Jude left, I would still look over my shoulder, half expecting to see him, but he never reappeared. Life eventually returned to normal, but I still wonder what was going on with that guy. I wonder what he would have done if he'd gotten into our house, especially the time when I was alone. This happened a few summers ago. I have a ground floor apartment that's in an older house. The whole ground floor is mine, but it only has one bedroom and a decent-sized living room. The door at the front led straight outside, and my upstairs neighbor Joe has his own entrance as well. He was a single guy, about 10 years older than me. I was 31, so he's probably in his 40s. We never talked much, even though we had been neighbors for over 5 years at the time. Joe was a quiet guy. Even though he lived right above me, I never heard a sound from him, barely even heard his footsteps. Our neighborhood was close to downtown, and it was a rougher part of town. Because of that, I had installed several security cameras in my place in case there was a robbery. It hadn't happened to me yet, but some other people on my street had experienced break-ins, so I wanted to protect myself. They were just small motion-censored cameras that upload straight to the cloud, so there was no need to drill into the walls. They just stick right onto the wall, and then you barely notice them. On a Friday night, I went out for drinks with a few friends. There was a street near my place that had a lot of small independent bars and pubs. My friends and I would go there sometimes, probably once a month. By around midnight, we had had enough and decided to head home. It was raining when we stepped out onto the sidewalk, just a light mist. We all headed our separate ways. It was a short walk from me, so I was home in less than 10 minutes. By the time I got to my place, the rain had picked up, and I was glad to be home before getting completely soaked. My head was buzzing lightly from the drinks, not enough to be a problem, but enough that I wanted to stay awake for a bit to sober up. I always found that I would sleep better when I did that. I opened my front door, took off my shoes, then laid on the couch in my living room. I flicked on the TV, not really paying attention to what was playing. It was probably a Seinfeld rerun, or something like that. I could still hear the sound of rain from the other side of my front window, and it wasn't long before I drifted off. Then I suddenly woke up, confused about why I was in the living room. Within a few seconds, I remembered. First thing I noticed was that it was cold. It was freezing in the house, way colder than it should have been. Then I saw it. The front door was wide open. Rain was coming in. The sound of it hitting the ground outside was now much clearer and louder. My heart skipped a beat, not out of fear, but more out of confusion. I got up and closed the door, still not sure what was going on. It struck me as odd that I might have left it open. I'm not usually that careless, even after a few drinks. But then again, everyone makes mistakes. Maybe in my slightly impaired state, I had forgotten to shut it. Trying to push away that nagging feeling in the back of my mind, I checked the main floor quickly. Nothing seemed out of place, so I decided to head to bed, convincing myself that the open door was just a silly mistake on my part. I went to the bathroom and brushed my teeth, then immediately collapsed on my bed and fell asleep right away. Morning came, and everything seemed normal. Sunlight filtered through the curtains in my room, and the rain had stopped. As I came out of my bedroom, I was half expecting to find something wrong, but everything was as I left it. No signs of a break-in, and nothing was stolen. But something still felt off. On a whim, I decided to check the security cameras I had installed around my house. I never really expected to use them for anything serious. They were more for peace of mind than anything else. I sat down at my coffee table and started scrolling through the footage from the previous night. They were on a motion sensor, so there were only a few clips. The first one I saw was me coming in at around midnight. I wasn't expecting to see anything else until I woke up at around 2 a.m., but there was another one before it. The timestamp for the video showed around 1:30 a.m. My neighbor Joe appeared on the screen. He walked right into my house through the front door. That alone was enough to send a chill down my spine, but what he did next was even more disturbing. He walked over and stood next to me while I was asleep on the couch, just watching. The TV's light was flickering on his back as he stood over me. He was there for what seemed like an eternity before he did something that still haunts me. He bent down and placed his hand on my head, almost tenderly, before standing up and walking out of frame. Not in the direction of the door, though. He went towards my bedroom. There was a camera in my bedroom, but when I checked it, the room was too dark to see anything. I think he went in there, though. I scrolled through the footage, trying to find the shot of him leaving, but when I finally found it, the timestamp was for 5 a.m. That meant my neighbor was hiding in my room when I went to bed the night before. He was probably in my closet or under the bed. I sat there and watched the footage over and over again. I couldn't make sense of it. Why would he come into my house? I had no answers. I called the police that day and spoke to our landlord soon after. When he found out what Joe had done, our landlord agreed to kick him out. Unfortunately, the police did nothing more than give him a warning. I can't understand how there wasn't more they could do with video evidence, but that was it. No justice, but at least he was gone. It was a cold evening close to Christmas when this event took place. I'm a single father, and at the time, my daughter was 8 years old. We lived in a small apartment building, and it was only 3 floors. Our unit was on the 2nd floor. There was a balcony off my room, and it was almost low enough that you could probably climb up. My daughter's room was right next to mine, and there was no balcony, just a window. The other residents in the building included a single guy right next door to me. There was also a family across the hall with a teenage daughter named Angela. I got along with all of them, but never got to know them very well. My job required me to go to a Christmas party, so I needed a babysitter. My neighbor across the hall seemed like a good choice. I had seen her around often, but this was the first time I had asked her to babysit. She seemed happy for the chance to make a bit of money, so we agreed that she would do it. If it worked out, then it would be very convenient to have a babysitter so close by. When she arrived, I told Angela that I would be back at around 10:30. That was well after my daughter's bedtime, so she would just need to hang out after that. I thanked her and went out the door. The event went longer than I expected, so I called Angela to see if she could stay. She told me it was fine, so I was relieved. When I finally came home, Angela was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. My daughter was already in bed, sound asleep. Everything seemed normal. I paid her, and she left. It was almost midnight by then, so I thought she would be tired. As I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something odd in the living room on the table. Alongside the small cup that my daughter used, there were 2 glasses, which struck me as strange. Why would my babysitter need 2 glasses? For a moment, I wondered if she'd had somebody over. I never specifically told her not to, but it seemed like a given. If she was having friends over to my place when I wasn't there, then I would be annoyed. In that case, I wouldn't have had her over again. It was too late to worry about that, so I decided to deal with it later. I was just about to turn in for the night when I heard a noise. It came from my daughter's room. At first, I thought she might be having a nightmare or talking in her sleep, something that wasn't uncommon for her. But as I got closer to her room, I realized that the noise was different. It was more of a shuffling or a sliding sound. I thought it sounded like the window was being pushed open. I opened the door as quietly as I could, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There was a man halfway through her window, trying to climb into the room. He was a young guy, probably only 18 or 19 years old. He had dark black hair, white skin, and a lip ring. I also saw one of his hands on the window frame. There was a black star tattoo right between his thumb and index finger. I yelled at him, and he was clearly startled. He struggled for a second, then turned back and fled through the window. I rushed to my daughter's bed. Thankfully she was okay, but she had woken up from the commotion. Cold air flooded into the room from the half-open window, so I walked over to it and shut it. Then I flipped the lock into place. When that was done, I tried to put my daughter back to bed, and after 10 or 15 minutes, she was asleep. I called the police right after. When they got there, I described the guy. Luckily, I had gotten a pretty good look at him, and there were several distinct characteristics about him, the tattoo and lip ring being the most obvious. They found footprints outside in the snow, and with the help of my description, they eventually traced them to a young man. It turned out that he was the boyfriend of Angela. When they questioned her, she denied having him over that night, but the evidence was clear, and I think she was lying. The police handled the situation, and the young man was charged. Angela was let off with a warning, but I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. I had put my trust in her to protect my daughter, and she allowed a stranger into our home. A stranger who turned out to be a real bad guy. I still wonder exactly what happened that night. Those two were alone with my daughter for the whole evening, so why did he have to break in? My only guess is that he couldn't try anything while Angela was around. She may have let that creep into my apartment, but that doesn't mean she knew what a psycho he was. Maybe she was in denial. Also, I know for a fact that my daughter's window was locked. It was winter, so it stayed closed, and I never would have unlocked it. So I think that guy went into my daughter's room and unlocked the window so we could come back later and climb in. It was a sliding 2-pane window that could be slid open from the inside or out, but the latch was on the inside part, and there would have been no way to open it from the outside. When I went out to check out how he climbed in, I saw that my balcony was close enough to the window that you could probably lean over and get to it. That must have been how he did it. It's one of the creepiest things that ever happened to me, and I'm so glad that I checked on my daughter at the right time. I moved to the United States in my mid-20s, which was about 15 years ago. Originally, I came on a student visa, but I didn't want to live in student housing because I thought I was too old. Instead, I bounced around in various short-term rentals, as well as crashing with a friend of my brother's. It wasn't good for my schoolwork, and I really wanted to find a more stable place. After months of that, I finally scraped together enough cash to rent a basement apartment in an old house. It wasn't much, but it was better than where I had been living. The place was small, only a single room with low ceilings and barely any natural light. It was a self-contained apartment, though. I had a small kitchen and a bathroom to myself. I even had my own laundry. On the far end of my apartment, there was a door that was sealed off. On the other side was the laundry room for the upstairs tenant. I knew that because I could hear him whenever he put in a load. The door didn't have a knob, and it was permanently locked, but there was a crack at the bottom where I could see a streak of light that would shine in. It was kind of awkward when he would be down there, because I felt like he was right next to me. My entrance was at the side of the house, and the doorway was the same for my place and for the upstairs tenant. There were stairs down to my apartment, and I had my own locking door. Above me lived a guy named Paul, probably in his 30s. He was tall with an athletic build and a habit of talking to himself. Sound traveled well in that place, so whenever I was home, I would hear his footsteps and his voice, even when he was alone. I rarely saw him, but I often heard him through my ceiling, sometimes late into the night. There was something about him that set me on edge. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I made a point to avoid him. My schoolwork and part-time job at a grocery store kept me busy, and I was grateful for the distraction. It wasn't much, but it helped keep my mind off the loneliness and strangeness of my surroundings. At the time, I had still only been in the country for just over 6 months. One night, a few months after moving in, I was lying in my bed awake, but really tired. Then there was a sound that caught my attention. It was just a creak of somebody on the stairs leading down to my apartment. I lay there listening. Like I said, the stairs were not technically in my apartment, but there would be no reason for Paul or anyone else to use them. They didn't lead anywhere else. I quietly got out of bed and tiptoed to the light switch. As soon as I turned it on, the footsteps stopped. I stood there, heart pounding, staring at the door. Nothing happened. After a few minutes, I convinced myself that it was my imagination. Then I went to bed and fell asleep soon after. In the morning, I went to the stairs to check, not really knowing what to expect. There was nothing out of the ordinary, so I figured it was nothing. But it happened again and again. Each time, I would turn on the light, and the footsteps would stop. I mentioned it to Paul one day, but he just shrugged it off and mumbled something about the old house making noises. I thought he was up to something, but I couldn't prove it. Even if it was him, he hadn't broken in or anything. Not yet. Another night, I was sleeping and suddenly sprung awake. There were no footsteps on the stairs this time. Instead, I heard someone on the other side of that door to Paul's laundry. It was just a faint rustling. I sat up and looked over, but there was no light on. Otherwise, I might have thought Paul was doing a late load of laundry. It was technically part of his place after all. Then I heard a scraping on the door and started freaking out. The door was supposed to be sealed off, but it sounded like somebody was trying to open it. Before I knew it, the door creaked open. I shot up in bed, my heart in my throat. Standing in the doorway was my upstairs neighbor Paul, his face partially hidden in the shadows, but it was definitely him.
Sorry,
He said in a voice that was eerily calm.
I thought you were asleep.
He didn't move, just stood there watching me. What do you want? My voice was barely a whisper. He smiled, then said,
Just checking on you. You're new here, all alone.
I didn't respond. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. He took a step forward, and I instinctively reached for the lamp on my bedside table. The moment I turned it on, Paul burst in and ran towards me. I jumped up and barely managed to get out the door. I pulled it closed behind me, but couldn't lock it from the outside. I didn't have my keys. Knowing there wasn't much time, I ran up the stairs and out of the house in my bare feet. Our next-door neighbor was a kind old woman, but it was the middle of the night. I rang her doorbell anyway, and to my relief, she answered. She invited me in and called the police for me. When they arrived, one of the officers told me that my neighbor had a history of, shall we say, troubling behavior, but nothing they could act on until now. Up until then, it was mainly complaints from people who he worked with, but nothing concrete. He was arrested that night, and when our landlord found out, Paul was kicked out of the place upstairs. I was angry about the whole thing, but I didn't have anywhere else to go, so I stayed there for another year. When I finally left, it was a huge relief.